The order came just before dawn, carried on a voice so flat it almost blended with the pounding surf. "Remove your clothes." The women froze. The humid air of Manila's port stuck to their skin like glue, a second, clammy uniform. Around them, the chaotic soundtrack of the port continued. Crates clattered, ropes strained under immense weight, and somewhere in the distance, a British truck backfired, making several women jump. But on this line, for these 300 captured Japanese nurses, clerks, and civilians, time stopped. They had been raised on stories of Allied vengeance, of brutal retribution. Now, standing defeated on foreign gravel, it felt like their turn had come. One woman, her voice barely a whisper, murmured, "So this is how we die." The guards did not respond. They just waited, silhouettes against the gray, pre-dawn light. Boots shifted on gravel. A lone seagull cried overhead. The air was a toxic cocktail, the smell of salt, diesel, and raw fear mixing into something metallic and sharp. Most of the women had marched for days to reach this port, their uniforms stained with mud, sweat, and the blood of the wounded they could no longer help. When the order came, it was not shouted with rage. It was announced. It was calm, procedural, almost rehearsed. That detached calm made it infinitely worse. In that suffocating stillness, a second voice broke through. The accent was British, young, and clear. "You will be inspected for lice and infection. This is a medical procedure. No harm will come to you." The words did not fit the moment. They were a logical impossibility. A soldier explaining mercy. It was a trick. The women hesitated, glancing at each other, their terror shifting into profound confusion. The guards waited longer. Sweat rolled down spines. Dust, stirred by the sea breeze, clung to their bare ankles. No one moved first. Then one woman, a former nurse named Ako, stepped forward. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely find her buttons as she unbuttoned her filthy tunic. The others followed, one by one, their shame burning hotter than their fear. Behind them, Allied medics unfolded white sheets. Not ropes, not rifles, towels. The shock of it hit harder than any bullet could have. One British officer, barely a man, turned his face away as he handed Ako a towel. She had braced for disgust, for cruelty, for leering eyes, but what she saw was embarrassment. That single unexpected flicker of decency cracked something deep inside her. This was not how enemies were supposed to behave. As they dried off, she noticed the guards were keeping their distance, their heads bowed slightly, as if acknowledging the prisoner's vulnerability rather than dominating it. The air felt different now. It was not safe, but it was strange, too civilized for a war zone. When the inspection ended, no one spoke. The women stood in a stunned, dripping silence, still clutching their towels, unsure whether to thank their captors or fear what came next. But before they could decide, another voice called out, "Proceed to medical tents for further checks." The next step would show them what this strange inspection truly meant. The women entered a canvas tent that smelled of iodine, damp canvas, and something vaguely like soap. Lanterns flickered against the khaki walls, casting long, dancing shadows. For the first time since their capture, they were out of the oppressive sun. Ako clutched her towel tighter, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, louder than the shuffle of bare feet around her. She expected more humiliation, maybe interrogation, maybe photographs. Instead, a man in a faded British medical uniform stepped forward. He held a clipboard, and his eyes were tired, but steady. "Name?" he asked softly. There was no bark, no sneer, just procedure. Behind him, two nurses in white coats laid out disinfectant, gauze, and bars of soap. The women exchanged confused, frightened glances. One whispered, "They are treating us." The officer, Captain Wallace, did not look at their faces as he worked. He clinically noted bruises, checked for fever, and applied ointment to open wounds with a practiced hand. When he reached Ako, he paused. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably. "You are safe here," he murmured, though he knew, and she knew, that the words would mean little. Outside, the noise of ships and trucks bled through the tent flaps. The war still roared just beyond this small, impossible island of mercy. But inside, something fragile was forming. A truce that no general had ordered. Akko could not stop watching him, not because he was kind, but because he seemed burdened by that kindness, as if decency itself was a dangerous act in wartime. She noticed how he deliberately turned his head away each time a woman reached for a towel or adjusted her blanket. No smirks, no lingering eyes, just a profound discomfort, the kind that comes only from empathy. Later, the women were led to a wash basin filled with hot water. Actual hot water and real soap. Their reflections in the steel basin made them flinch. They were filthy, thin, unrecognizable, but alive, and no one shouted at them. No one struck them. Back home, Akko whispered to the woman beside her. They would have left us to rot if we failed. The other nurse did not reply. She just nodded slowly, her eyes filling with something that was not quite tears. Maybe it was confusion. Maybe it was guilt. By the time the inspection ended, the women were quiet, wrapped in clean, rough blankets. The guards carried their old, soiled uniforms away to be burned. Outside, the setting sun threw long, dramatic shadows over the tents. For the first time, Akko realized these men did not hate them. They pitied them. And pity, she would soon learn, could be far more disarming than hate. By morning, the camp smelled of broth. Not gun oil, not diesel, not sweat. Broth. Steam curled from massive tin pots over open fires as British and Australian orderlies moved between the tents, handing out metal bowls. The Japanese women hesitated again, their bodies tensing. Every sense they had, honed by years of war and propaganda, screamed trap. Their last warm meal had been months ago, a meager portion of rice served by their own army before the final surrender. Since then, food had meant survival of the fittest, stealing, bargaining, enduring. Now, the enemy was offering them soup. Akko watched a young soldier, his face pink from the steam, ladle brownish liquid into her bowl. He did not speak Japanese, but he smiled awkwardly, gesturing for her to eat. She waited, watching the others. No one tasted it first, but the smell, meat, onions, maybe barley, was too real, too visceral to resist. One woman finally raised the spoon, then another. No one fell. When Akko finally took her first sip, the warmth hit her system like an electrical shock. It was not just food, it was proof. Proof that something fundamental she believed about the enemy, about the world, was wrong. Nearby, another guard offered bread. Real bread. Soft, white, and still warm from an oven somewhere. Akko took a piece and just stared at it, turning it over in her hands as if it were a religious relic. "They feed us better than our officers did," whispered one nurse, so low that only Akko could hear. The guard did not react. He probably did not understand the words, but the confession hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Across Allied camps, official reports would later note similar, disorienting moments. Statistically, a Japanese POW had nearly double the survival rate under Allied control than an Allied prisoner had under Japanese control. The rough math was horrifying, 72% versus 35%. Numbers, cold as stone. Yet here, in this camp, every sip of soup felt like a quiet defiance against those odds. Akko tried to keep her face blank. She did not want them to see her gratitude. Gratitude was weakness. But when the same young soldier returned and refilled her bowl without being asked, her control cracked. "Why?" she muttered, half to herself, half to him. He shrugged, not understanding her word, but grasping her meaning. He motioned to the Red Cross symbol painted on the kitchen crate. "Rules," he said, tapping the symbol. "Not mercy. Rules." Somehow, that made it even harder to process. This was not a personal whim. It was a policy. Their enemy had institutionalized decency. Later, when the bowls were collected, Akko caught her reflection in the pot's metallic sheen, eyes swollen, hair matted, but undeniably alive. Around her, women were whispering prayers they had not said since childhood. For the first time since their capture, they were not thinking about death. They were thinking about tomorrow. By the third day, the shock had transformed into a strange, brittle routine. Wake up, line up, eat, wash. But nothing felt real. The barbed wire glinted in the morning sun, a stark reminder of their captivity. Guards patrolled with rifles, yet they smiled. Akko could not understand this impossible new world, a world where victors handed cigarettes to their prisoners. It went against everything she had been taught about honor, the enemy, and the profound shame of surrender. Near the fence, an Australian corporal, lanky and sunburnt, flicked a lighter open and gestured toward the group. "Smoke," he offered in slow, broken Japanese. A few women turned away, suspicious. But one, hands trembling, reached out. When the first puff of tobacco hit her lungs, she coughed, a dry, racking sound that quickly turned into a laugh. A stunned, bewildered laugh that spread through the group like static electricity. Within minutes, the fence line looked less like a prison and more like a small, strange cafe after a battle. Prisoners sat cross-legged, sharing cigarettes, whispering. It was not comfort. It was a profound, shared confusion. Their training had painted the Allies as inhuman monsters. Yet here was a man who apologized when he accidentally brushed a prisoner's arm. Akko noted the detail, like a scientist cataloging an impossible specimen. Behind her, the British Sergeant Wallace, the same one from the inspection, watched silently. He kept the routine strict, meals on time, roll calls precise, medical checks regular. Yet beneath the rigid discipline, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of respect. "They treat us like soldiers," one woman muttered, half in disbelief. Another corrected her, her voice barely audible. "No, like humans." That evening, Akko was summoned to assist in the infirmary. They had learned she was a nurse and needed help sorting supplies. Inside the tent, she saw boxes stacked high, all stamped Medical Corps, Commonwealth, clean bandages, morphine, quinine. She would never seen such abundance. Japan's own military hospitals had been running on scraps and desperation for the war's final agonizing year. She could not help whispering. They had too much to lose. It was an industrial victory, visible in every gauze roll and tin cup. When her shift ended, the same Australian corporal from the fence handed her a cigarette for herself. She hesitated. "Why?" she asked. This time, in clear English. He exhaled a plume of smoke and grinned, his eyes crinkling. "Because you look like you need one, nurse." That night, Akko could not sleep. The broth, the bread, the cigarette, the respect, it all churned inside her. She found a scrap of paper, a label torn from a ration tin. She had to write it down, to make it real. She wrote just one line, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her blanket. "The enemy is not what we were told." But by morning, that note would be gone, and its disappearance would set in motion a new, more dangerous chapter. The note Akko had written was gone by sunrise. The guards had searched the barracks at dawn. It was routine, efficient, and emotionless. Every scrap of paper was confiscated, every folded corner flattened by foreign hands, every personal item briefly inspected and returned. When the inspection ended, Akko's blanket felt lighter, emptier, as if a small, vital piece of her had been taken with it. Around her, quiet murmurs spread. Letters, drawings, even pressed flowers found in pockets, all gone. The small, secret items that proved they were still individuals had been purged. That afternoon, a British corporal read from the camp bulletin board, his voice loud and flat. No personal correspondence permitted until review by command. The announcement echoed through the yard, translated in fragments by a Japanese interpreter. Some women lowered their heads. Others just stared blankly at the ground. They were not angry. They were hollow. For them, words were the only escape, the only way to process the impossible shift in their reality. And now, even that was forbidden. But Akko could not let it end there. The need to document, to understand, was stronger than the rule. That night, under the dim, flickering lantern light of the infirmary tent where she now worked, she began writing again. This time, she wrote on the back of a medical supply label, the paper stiff and glossy. "To whoever finds this," she began, her hand trembling. "I was taught that surrender erased honor, but here I see men who show more honor than those who taught me." The words felt alive, dangerous, and true. By the end of the week, dozens of such letters were circulating secretly among the POWs. They were not messages home. That was an impossible dream. They were quiet confessions, attempts to reconcile their indoctrination with their reality. Some apologized to their dead comrades. Others described the small mercies, the soup, the cigarettes, the averted eyes. Historians would later find that over 170 such POW letters were archived, censored, or destroyed in Allied custody. Most were never read by anyone but the guards who found them. One evening, as Akko folded her new letter, a familiar voice interrupted the tense stillness. "You should not risk this." Sergeant Wallace stood in the doorway, his tall frame a shadow against the dusk. He did not raise his rifle. He did not shout. His tone was not threatening. It was weary, almost protective. She met his eyes, her heart pounding, but she did not hide the paper. "Why do you care?" she asked softly. He did not answer. He just took the paper from her, hesitated for a long second, and then, instead of tearing it up, he slipped it into his own chest pocket. Days passed. Rumors began to spread that some guards were keeping the letters not for intelligence, but because they could not bring themselves to throw them away. Human words, written by the enemy, were harder to destroy than military orders. Akko never saw her letter again. But weeks later, she noticed the sergeant always carried something folded inside his chest pocket, a small square pressed against his heart. She never asked if it was hers. She did not need to. That letter, sealed in silence, would soon decide both their fates. Sergeant Wallace sat on the edge of his bunk, the camp muffled in post-curfew silence. Outside, the jungle hummed with crickets and the distant engines of supply trucks. His focus was on the folded piece of paper resting in his palm. Her letter. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, shaped by a discipline he recognized. He had confiscated dozens before, and all had been destroyed per protocol. But this one he would kept. He told himself it was for documentation. He knew that was a lie. He unfolded it again. The ink had bled slightly from the humidity and his own sweat, but the words remained clear. They treat us with respect we do not deserve. Perhaps that is their strength. Wallace read it twice, then a third time. He would seen his share of prisoners, some violent, some broken, some defiant. But he had never encountered anyone who mirrored his own doubts back at him. Every guard had a coping rule. Don't think too much. Don't learn their names. But after months on duty, the walls between duty and empathy were wearing thin. Commanders did not warn you about that. They taught you how to keep order, not how to stay human. The next morning, during roll call, Wallace caught Akko's eye for a moment longer than he should have. She bowed slightly, a gesture of quiet understanding, not defiance or submission. That single fleeting moment would have gone unnoticed if another soldier had not been watching. By midday, new rumors crawled through the barracks. The Brit's gone soft. He is protecting one of them. It was not true. Not in the way they meant, but in war, truth mattered far less than perception. That night, Lieutenant Harris summoned him. "Keep your distance, Wallace," the officer warned, his voice sharp. "We are not here to make friends." Wallace nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, sir." But his mind replayed the words from her letter again and again. Allied records from 1945 show that nearly 1 in 12 guards reported psychological strain from prolonged POW contact. The military called it sentimental fatigue. Wallace called it a conscience. He returned to his post, the folded letter still in his pocket. The barbed wire gleamed in the moonlight. Akko stood near the fence, silent, watching the sea. Their eyes met briefly, two prisoners of circumstance, divided by rules neither of them fully believed in anymore. Behind them, in the darkness of the barracks, the whispers grew louder. The camp was changing. Kindness had become suspect. The very humanity that had once shocked the prisoners was now turning against the men who showed it. By the end of that week, the camp felt colder, though the suffocating Manila heat had not changed. The soldiers spoke less and smoked more. The easy, casual banter that had once drifted between the guards and the prisoners, and even among the guards themselves, was replaced by clipped orders and suspicious murmurs. "You hear about Wallace," someone whispered in the mess hall. just loud enough to be heard, reads their letters, talks to them like they are people. A few men laughed nervously, but others did not. In war, mercy is a dangerous liability. It blurs the line, the essential, sharp line that makes killing possible. Rumors spread fast in the isolated, humid compound. The cooks claimed Wallace was giving extra bread to a specific Japanese nurse. The quartermaster swore he saw him pass. Something folded a note through the fence. None of it could be proven, but in the fast-moving machinery of military gossip, proof was never a requirement. By the third retelling, Sergeant Wallace was not just a lenient guard. He was a sympathizer, a potential security risk. The irony was not lost on him. The very decency they were ordered to show the Geneva rules, the medical inspections, the humane rations, was now being twisted into a weapon of suspicion against him. One corporal muttered, "You treat them soft, they will stab you in the back." Another replied, "She looks harmless, till the knife's in your ribs." It did not matter that there had not been a single escape attempt, or even a moment of aggression. Fear was the only oxygen in the barracks. Akko noticed the change, too. The cigarette stopped. The awkward smiles vanished. The guards, who had begun to see them, now looked through them again, their faces impassive masks. The small, fragile world of civility they had built was cracking, freezing over. One afternoon, during laundry duty, Akko overheard two Australian privates arguing just outside the supply shed. "You really think those women are just nurses?" one said, his voice low. "Spies. More like they know codes. Radio ops. I bet half of them were trained." The other shrugged. "Maybe. But they are beaten now. Leave it." That night, Wallace found a note on his cot. It was not signed. Just 3 words scrolled in rough pencil, "Watch your back." Reports from 1,945 confirmed that over 300 suspected espionage cases surfaced across Allied Pacific commands during this period. Most proved to be false, fueled by paranoia rather than evidence, but paranoia never needed evidence to be effective. By morning, new orders were posted on the bulletin board. Certain detainees to be relocated. Immediate transfer at dawn. A list of numbers and names followed. Akko's name was on it. When Wallace saw it, his throat went dry. He understood. Transfers happened all the time. But this one felt like an erasure, a punishment. The trucks were already idling when dawn cracked open the Manila sky. Headlights cut through the mist and dust, throwing long, stark white beams across the yard. Prisoners stood in rows, silent and expressionless, clutching their few possessions in burlap sacks. The invasive sound of the engines drowned out the morning birds. Akko was in the second row. Her name had been called 30 minutes earlier, her number stenciled onto a clipboard she was not allowed to see. Wallace scanned the manifest again. 51 prisoners scheduled for transfer to the American sector. Routine relocation, the lieutenant had said. But Wallace knew the pattern. The troublemakers, the outspoken, the ones who'd drawn too much attention. And Akko was on it. She caught his gaze once, as the guards began to count heads. No words were exchanged, just that same quiet, impossible recognition that had formed between them weeks ago. He wanted to say something, but speech felt dangerous now. A betrayal. The convoy commander barked, "Move." Boots crunched on gravel. Chains rattled softly, not restraints, but the sound of metal tailgates slamming shut. Each truck took on its load of prisoners, engines revving in a grim rhythm. Wallace walked alongside, his own clipboard pressed to his chest, the letter a sharp rectangle against his ribs. When Akko climbed aboard, she turned, hesitated, then did something that froze him completely. She saluted. It was not a gesture of mockery or surrender, but one of respect. A soldier's clean, precise acknowledgement of another. The nearby guards did not notice. Wallace stiffened instinctively, returning the salute with the smallest, most imperceptible nod he dared risk. Akko's last glimpse of him was through the slats of the truck's wooden side panels, a man standing alone by a wire fence. Dust rose behind the convoy as it began to roll forward, the morning sunlight bouncing off the barbed wire one last time. Reports show that nearly half of all POW transfers during the Pacific campaigns took place before sunrise, minimizing the risk of sabotage or escape. To the prisoners, it only magnified the sense of vanishing into the dark. As the vehicles rumbled out of the British compound, Wallace stood by the gate, his helmet under his arm. The convoy faded into the haze, swallowed by the road leading toward the American run camp near Batangas. He did not move for a long time. He had her letter, her handwriting, her story, folded in his pocket, and a growing cold suspicion that this transfer was no ordinary relocation, because the Americans ran their camps differently. Colder, cleaner, and far less forgiving. The American camp did not smell like war. It smelled like bleach and asphalt. When the convoy of trucks rolled through the high, imposing gates, Akko's first impression was the silence. There was no shouting, no chaotic clatter, just order. Whitewashed barracks stood in perfect, sterile rows. American flags snapped rigidly in the coastal wind. The guards, in their pressed, clean uniforms, barely glanced at the prisoners as they disembarked. Everything was efficient, sterile, and profoundly impersonal. A sergeant with a clipboard called out names in quick, flat English. Each woman stepped forward, was assigned a new number, and was then guided to a designated bunk. It felt less like captivity and more like processing, like being turned into data. The British, with their awkward smiles and shared cigarettes, had treated them like people. The Americans, it seemed, treated them like paperwork. Akko tried to understand the new rhythm. It was a rhythm of cold efficiency. Meals were exact. 0700, 1200, 1800. Hygiene inspections were daily. Medical checks were weekly. Even their movements between the barracks and the mess hall were timed. The food was not bad canned beans, processed bread, bitter coffee, but it all tasted of metal and control. The Americans spoke less and smiled not at all. Their kindness was procedural, not emotional. The Red Cross emblem hung on every building, a symbol of a bureaucracy of mercy, but no one looked up when the prisoners passed. Compassion here had been industrialized. At night, Akko lay awake, staring at the corrugated metal roof, glinting in the moonlight. The ocean roared faintly in the distance, a constant, taunting reminder of a freedom that lay just beyond the wire. She missed the British sergeant's quiet, weary nods. She missed the small human gestures that had felt so monumental. Here, the guards did not pointedly look away when the women undressed for inspection. They did not really look at all. Their eyes were vacant, detached. Reports show that after 1945, American POW facilities processed more than 100,000 Axis captives per week across the Pacific theater. Efficiency meant survival, but it also meant distance. Akko learned the new rules quickly. Obey. Stay invisible. Forget softness. Yet, part of her could not forget the towel handed to her in Manila, the cigarette shared through a fence. Humanity, once tasted, could not be untasted. One afternoon, a notice appeared on the barracks door, typed in clean block letters. Mandatory showers. All detainees. Hygiene inspection. The word sent a ripple of dread through the room. The women froze, their minds flashing back to that first terrifying command at the port, undress. No one spoke. The past was looping back on itself, and they did not yet know if mercy had an expiration date. The order was for dawn. Akko stood in line again, the sun just beginning to climb, baking the corrugated roofs in a blinding gold. The déjà vu was suffocating. The same posture, the same words. Undress. Only this time, the guard's tone was clipped, administrative, like he was reading from a manual. Inside the concrete shower block, the air stung of disinfectant and wet lime. Pipes ran across the ceiling, their valves hissing softly. American medics moved briskly, rubber gloves snapping as they gestured the prisoners forward. There was no malice, no hesitation, just the hum of machinery and orders being obeyed. Akko's stomach knotted. The memory of that first moment in Manila, the towel, the terror, rushed back. She whispered to the woman beside her, "Do you think it is the same?" The woman did not answer. Steam hissed, echoing like distant shellfire. Then, a fine, cold mist sprayed from nozzles in the ceiling, filling the room. The women flinched, shielding their faces, bracing for what? But it was not gas. It was disinfectant. Cold, sharp, and chemical. The smell of DDT mixed with soap and metal, flooding every sense. One of the nurses in white coats shouted over the noise. "Keep your eyes closed. 2 minutes." The Americans had reduced hygiene to a science. Every motion was timed. Every droplet measured. The result, as reports would later note, was a 90% reduction in louse-borne disease in camps that used these new DDT protocols. To the medics, it was a victory through sanitation. To the prisoners, it was just another layer of confusion. As Ako scrubbed herself with the coarse soap, something inside her finally shifted. This was not humiliation anymore. It was decontamination. They were not cleansing her as an enemy. They were cleansing her as a human organism. When the valve shut off, silence fell, broken only by the dripping water. The guards handed out towels, their faces blank, detached. Ako wrapped herself, trembling, not from fear, but from the cold. She realized the terror had evaporated. Not because she trusted them, but because this ritual was not about power. It was about procedure. As the line moved toward the exit, a mirror above the wash basins caught her reflection. For the first time, she saw no prisoner, no enemy, just a survivor. But that reflection would haunt her, because soon she would have to face what survival truly meant. The announcement came not with gunfire or trumpets, but through a crackling loudspeaker mounted on a jeep. Midday, the 15th of August, 1945. The American camp stood still under the burning tropical sun. A sergeant adjusted the dial, his voice barely louder than the static. Japan has accepted the terms of unconditional surrender. For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the humid air like smoke. The Japanese women froze in place, hands still mid-task. No cheering, no collapse, just silence, so complete the wind seemed to stop. Ako's breath caught. She would imagined this day 1,000 ways: fire, vengeance, suicide. But this? A single calm voice declaring the end of her entire world. Around her, women stared at one another, waiting for someone to interpret the meaning. The American guards did not celebrate. They simply removed their helmets and stood in the stillness. Even they seemed to sense this was not just victory. It was a eulogy. Ako sank to her knees, not from grief, but from a profound, emptying confusion. If surrender was not shame, what was it? She remembered the mirror, the towel, the cigarette, the small mercies that had redefined her idea of honor. Maybe this was not defeat. Maybe it was release. Nearby, an American officer lowered the camp flag to half-mast, a gesture that made the women whisper, "Respect for the dead." For everyone who had not survived to hear the radio crackle, the war was over. The ocean was glass when the repatriation ship left Manila Bay. Rows of Japanese women stood along the railing, wearing the khaki, ill-fitting coats issued to them by the Allies. They watched the city, the port, the island shrink into a hazy green line on the horizon. The war was over, but the air still carried its taste. Salt, rust, and memory. Ako leaned against the railing, a small canvas bag at her feet. Inside was a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and nothing else. The Allies had given them back their freedom, but freedom did not feel familiar anymore. For days, the ship sailed through unnaturally calm waters, cutting across an invisible map of now silent battlefields. Each sunrise painted the deck in a pale silver light, and each evening the women gathered quietly, staring east toward a home they could no longer properly picture. The American guards on board treated them well enough. A polite, measured distance, but no one spoke much. It was as if everyone understood that words might break the fragile, glassy silence that was holding the new world together. Ako kept thinking of the mirror, the towel, and the letter she would written, the one Sergeant Wallace had kept. She wondered if he would survive the war, or if his small act of conscience had cost him more than just his rank. There was no way to know. All that remained were those fragments, those impossible moments of decency in a war built on systematic cruelty. When Japan's coastline finally appeared, a gray, smudged silhouette through the morning mist, no one cheered. Some women cried quietly, burying their faces in their hands. Others just stared, their faces blank. The docks were crowded with officials, nurses, and silent men in armbands that read Repatriation Authority. The city beyond was unrecognizable. Tokyo lay in ruins. Rooftops were twisted like scorched paper. Streets were lined with blackened brick and skeletal trees. Even the air smelled different: smoke, seaweed, and the unmistakable scent of defeat. Over 6.4 million Japanese citizens would return home between 1945 and 1950. But home, for most, no longer existed. The empire they had pledged their lives to had vanished. What waited for them was hunger, shame, and a vast, crushing uncertainty. As Ako stepped off the ship, she clutched her bag tighter. A child, his face smudged with soot, offered her a rice ball through the fence. It was half-cracked, but still warm. She bowed deeply, tears finally burning her eyes. Kindness. Again. From a stranger. Just when she thought she would forgotten what it looked like. That night, in a crowded, noisy dormitory, she unpacked her few belongings. At the bottom of the bag, folded and yellowed, was a piece of paper the guards had missed: the unfinished letter from the medical tent, the one she thought was long gone. It was still waiting for an ending. Years passed before anyone opened that envelope again. By then, the paper had yellowed to the color of old ivory, and the ink had bled slightly. But Ako's handwriting was still graceful, disciplined, even in its sorrow. She had hidden the letter for decades, folded into the lining of an old coat she refused to throw away. Time moved on. There was the occupation, the rebuilding, a new flag, a new anthem. But every August, when the cicadas began to hum their deafening, static-filled song, she would find herself touching that hidden pocket, remembering the day she first wrote those words. In 2019, long after her death, her granddaughter donated the coat to a small history museum in Canberra, Australia. The archivist almost missed it. The paper was tucked deep inside, fragile as a dried leaf. When unfolded, the first line read, "To the man who showed me mercy when war forgot how." The handwriting was dated 1945. No surname, just Ako. The letter described the Manila camp, the towel, the cigarette, the transfer. It was not a love letter. It was a record of transformation. "I was taught we must die with honor," it read. "But you taught me there is honor in letting others live." Curators, intrigued, traced the details: the camp, the unit. They found a matching name in British war logs. Sergeant David Wallace, Royal Army Medical Corps. Survived 1945. Discharged in 1946. Among his personal effects, donated by his son decades later, was a small bundle of personal items from his service. Tucked inside a worn wallet was a folded piece of paper written in Japanese. Translated by hand on the back, in faint pencil, were the same phrases. "They treat us with respect we do not deserve." 2 letters, 2 sides of the same war, preserved continents apart. The historian who discovered the match wrote, "It was not strategy that ended their hatred. It was small, individual decencies." The documents became part of an exhibit titled "Mercy Outlasts Victory." Visitors would stop in front of the display, reading her words beneath the dim museum lights. No uniforms, no medals, just handwriting and silence. In the final line, Ako had written, "If this letter survives, let it tell the truth. The enemy I feared most was my own heart." Her granddaughter stood before that glass case on opening day, eyes wet, whispering her grandmother's name. Outside, rain tapped against the museum windows, soft, persistent, like the echo of a ship's engine fading into the fog. The war had ended 70 years earlier, but her words were still marching.